So welcome everyone. Welcome to Suiting Up Women in the Fashion of Armor. My name is Andrew Jacobs. He, him pronouns. I'm a professor of communication studies at RCC, and I also teach gender studies at RCC as well. Tonight I'm joined on this panel by Dr. Christina Stern, she, her pronouns, a professor of history and a specialist in the Middle Ages. And Zuzu Tadeushuk, she, her pronouns, who not only teaches at RCC, but is herself an RCC Honors Program alum. And this panel discussion was her brainchild, an outgrowth of her thesis at Wesleyan University as part of her degree in feminist gender and sexuality studies. And that thesis was an academic and personal rumination on her experience as a high fashion model and led her to write further on the fashion of armor. So tonight, our 1-hour panel discussion will be in 3 parts. First, each of us will make some brief opening remarks about women in the fashion of armor. We'll first start with Dr. Stern, then we'll go to me, and then Professor Tadeushuk. And then after our initial comments, we'll spend some time in conversation. And then last, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. So without further ado, let me hand the mic to Dr. Stern.
Hey, hi everybody. Welcome to tonight's program. We're happy that you're here. And yeah, I teach at RCC in the history department. And my own specialty is the European Middle Ages and then also the early modern period. Okay, so what I want to do tonight, and I have a whole bunch of, or not a whole bunch, but a few slides, just to help illustrate in terms of thinking about tonight's topic. So one of the figures in history, a female figure who is famous for being for wearing armor, is of course Joan of Arc. So I wanted to just say a little bit about her and a little bit about imagery and thinking about images and gender and history. So I'm going to take us in to share the screen. And if anybody has any problem seeing, please just call out so that I can rectify it right away so you don't miss out. And actually, should I, Andrew, should I just maximize the screen, you think, or?
Yeah.
Just maximize it. Okay. All right. So I will maximize it, optimize it. Okay. So, all right. So let me, oh, wait, sorry. Let me go back in again. Yeah, that should, there we go. Okay. All right. So I hope everybody can see this. And again, if you can't, please let me know, just call out if you are not able to see. All right, but this is one of the images of Joan of Arc, all right, and so just a couple of quick points, all right, so a little bit here about history, if someone's not able to see so well, okay, on the chat, okay, yeah, so I will try. So the image that I am showing now is a historical image of Joan of Arc. All right, and this is an image from the late 1400s, or mid to late 1400s, right? And it's basically an image of a woman in armor, and she's carrying several banners, and one has a few saints on them. All right, and so this is the thing, when we look at history and when we look at, you know, issues with women in history, right? Joan of Arc was particularly interesting. If you ask the question, who was Joan of Arc? Right, a powerful warrior, a political visionary, a madwoman who received visions, a religious heretic, a blasphemer, right, or a saint, and ultimately she was canonized in hundreds of years after she lived. She was canonized by the Catholic Church as a saint, right? But in her own time, she was sentenced to death for blasphemy. And for heresy, right? Basically, charges against the church, charges against religion, religious doctrine, and some of those charges were connected in part with her dressing like a man, right? And so in 1431, she was burned to death, and this is an image of her at the stake, right? This is an image from the late 1400s. Right. So this is the thing, and this is just a key point when we look at historical records. And again, most of our program tonight is analysis more in the contemporary period, our modern period, but looking at or thinking about images of women in armor, but and if you look specifically at particular figures from history, and this is true for the ancient world, this is true for the Middle Ages, you have to keep in mind we often have very limited historical records, right? And especially visual records, right? And so here you see three different images of Joan of Arc, right? And basically in all of them, she has some type of armor. These three images are actually from the general time period, not exactly, or two of them not exactly, but more or less, they're pretty close to when she lived. And the first one here is actually during when she lived. But the thing is, we often are somewhat limited when we look at images, right? And you have to, always keep in mind, we only get photography, in the 1800s, right? So photography is less than 200 years old, all right, or roughly 200 years old. So when you're looking at anything before, we just don't have photos, right? We're always dealing with paintings, right? And then if you're looking at paintings, you always have to ask, well, when was a particular image made? And what's interesting with Joan of Arc, there are lots of images of her that were made, both in the Middle Ages, like these images, and then lots of images later, right? But images, especially images made later, where you do see her in full armor, right? These are several images, you see her in full armor, right? These images are made by people who did not know Joan of Arc, did not see Joan of Arc, lived hundreds of years later. So these images may or may not really tell you all that much about her, or about how she was valued in her own time period, right? And so just in terms of who Joan of Arc was, she's a figure from the late Middle Ages, right? And she's connected with the 100 Years' War. Right, and basically, to keep it to like 20 seconds, the 100 Years' War, a lot of that was basically a tale of battling kings. What were they battling over? France. And this here is basically, if you look at France today, if you take it back to the 1400s, you will see there were different kings who were battling for full control, and that included the King of England, right, who had a fair amount of control up in this area, and then the King of France down here, right, and then the Duke and Counts of Burgundy. So lots and lots of battling figures over who controls this land, right? And again, this is part of the end of the Middle Ages. And Joan of Arc becomes part of this story, right? And Joan of Arc was born in 1412 in Domremy, which is in France. And you can see that here, Domremy. So she was born in here. All right, and this is believed to be her birthplace, right? And so basically what happens is Joan of Arc gets involved in this story, and she inserts herself on behalf of or in support of King Charles VII, right? And King Charles VII was the basically the French king, but he's battling against the English kings and some of these figures in Burgundy. And Joan of Arc, she goes to the king and she says she had visions, religious visions. She saw the Archangel Michael. She saw two female saints. And she basically says to Charles VII, God is on your side. I've been getting these visions and God is on your side to be the rightful, legitimate king, full king of France, right? And Charles, of course, is thrilled. He sends her in to the battles in the Orleans area. And this is the one image we have from that time period, which is kind of interesting, a woman carrying a banner, right? And here with the sword, right? So clearly military imagery, although not necessarily full armor in this image. And again, this image is from our time period and is part of a court record. But anyway, within a few days of her joining the battle, Charles VII does very well, and his forces do very well, right? And they're thrilled. They're thrilled about Joan. Joan then plays a part in his getting a formal coronation that year, right? But then the next year, there are more battles. She is caught in battle. by opposing forces. The opposing forces turn her over to a Catholic bishop and a French inquisitor, and they put Joan of Arc on trial. They charge her with 70 offenses, right, mainly relating to heresy and blasphemy. And in that, interwoven in that is the charge that she wore men's clothes, right? And then, you know, long story short, you know, she ends up being, you know, executed by burning, right? Which is a terrible way to die, but a way that was often a punishment used against heretics. So if you were guilty of heresy, often the punishment was being burned to death in the 1400s. So we have an image here from the 1400s, but again, this image is decades later. So the artist didn't actually see this happen, but had painted this image, right? And then what's interesting, so there's a lot of politics involved, right? Long story short, she is brought up on charges with heresy and wearing men's clothes, but there's a lot of politics involved because you have battling kings, and then you have different religious ecclesiastical forces involved, right? But what happens is later in the 1400s, her story is reevaluated, and the heresy charges start to be purged, you know, meaning they're reversed. And then later on, she's reevaluated more and more by, you know, by different people, players within the Catholic Church, and ultimately they canonize her. And this here is another later image of Joan in armor. And she also becomes known as the patron saint of France. She's often used by nationalist forces, you know, on behalf of the nation of France. But this is the thing. So these are the three images we have of her that are roughly, and I say roughly, from her time period. This first one over here with the sword, this is from, it seems, 1429. So that was actually, you know, during her life. This one here, this middle image, is somewhere from about 1450 to 1500. So this is decades after her life, you know, but it's interesting because here she is depicted in fairly full-scale armor, right? And with her weapons and banners. And this last image over here, this is the early 1500s, right? And it's sort of a softer form of armor that she is depicted as wearing, right? But the imagery of the horse, right? I mean, you associate in the Middle Ages, early modern, you know, horses are often, you know, are military symbols, right? You think of the knights, the medieval knights, right? So horses are themselves a type of military symbol. All right, so so that's just a little bit of background about her, who she was historically, and about the images. All right, and I'm going to turn it over then to Andrew and Zuzu.
Great. All right. Well, thank you very much, Christina. So let me also try to go into share mode here.
Oh, Andrew, a few people have their hand up. No? Oh, okay.
Let's see here. Actually, I need to go out of share. To rearrange a few things. Okay, so I hope everybody can see my screen at the moment. So maybe one thing I should just sort of say is that we're obviously going to be talking about not only Joan of Arc, but also some more contemporary images. And the image that that Zuzu and I really want to focus on is one of Zendaya at the Met Gala in 2018, where she wore this sort of amazing gown, which I'll show you shortly, where she's in a kind of armor, basically. And so that's also going to be kind of the focus of what we're talking about today. And so I want to begin my comments actually about armor by focusing on two observations by scholars of visual culture. And their comments are not actually about armor, but about nudity in clothing. And later I'll try to bring those to bear on Zendaya's Met Gala armor gown. So the first remark is by John Berger, who wrote an influential book called Ways of Seeing in 1973 about how we look at women in art and advertising. In that book, Berger argued that we should distinguish between what he called nakedness and what he called nudity. To be naked, Berger said, is to be oneself, to be unclothed but not observed or on display. When we step out of the shower in the morning and we're in a rush to prepare for the day, we may be naked, that is unclothed and unobserved, and without an eye toward how we are seen by other people. By contrast, Berger argued that to be nude is to be seen naked by others, and yet not recognized for oneself. As he put it, it's to be in disguise. To be nude, then, is to be on display to meet certain norms of visuality that take one away from being oneself. Berger strikingly concludes that nudity, in this sense, is really a form of dress. The second remark I want to talk about comes from the famous media analyst Marshall McLuhan, who wrote the following in his book, The Medium is the Message. And he wrote, all human media are extensions of some human faculty, psychic or physical. The wheel is an extension of the foot. The book is an extension of the eye. Clothing, an extension of the skin. If in fact clothing is the extension of the skin and nudity is a form of dress, one could extend this logic and argue that dress then is also a form of nudity. Dress as an extension of the skin accentuates, augments, magnifies, or heightens the skin, or of the body more generally. And by doing so is a kind of disguise that paradoxically draws our attention to what is underneath. Armor can be thought of as an extension of the skin, I think, in two important ways. First, skin is an organ that protects the body, as does armor. And second, skin is an organ that is sexually appealing, as is armor. In this analytic move, then, armor can be regarded as a form of nudity. The last observation I want to make before turning to Zendaya is that nudity as it is performed today is often a process of gendering. That is, a primary purpose of the convention of nudity is to distinguish the female and the feminine from the male and the masculine, to enact the binarization of gender. To put it another way, nudity and fashion, including the fashion of armor, often heighten or accentuate the gendered qualities of the skin. This is not to deny the androgynous and non-binary turn in fashion. This is a growing and important movement. But in spite of this trend, I think it remains true that much of fashion works to generate the gender binary, and this binarization, I think, is operative in Zendaya's gown. So let's turn to Zendaya's armor gown and see how this armor can be read as an extension of nudity. Despite her appropriation of the ultimate masculine attire, which I think is armor, and the presence of important androgynous elements, I think Zendaya provides the visual resources to ultimately read her as feminine. First, I think amongst these is that the outfit has the traditional structure of a gown, and this brings our armor into alignment with the visual norms of femininity. I think these three drawings, these images capture that even the silver is very similar, the silhouette is quite similar of the gown and armor, and like this bridal outfit here. Second, many elements of her outfit heightens her feminine embodiment. The plunging neckline, the plate armor that accentuates her hips, her necklace that draws the eye to her cleavage, the mandarin collar, etc. All of these draw our eyes and imagination to what lies beneath her armor. Third, the juxtaposition of the masculine elements, the armor itself and the medieval male page boy haircut, along with the feminine elements, heighten, I think, her feminine sexual allure in a similar way to Marlene Dietrich's tuxedo in the 1930 film Morocco. And so if you can't see these images too clearly, so here you've got Marlene Dietrich smoking a cigarette, wearing a top hat, and in a tight-fitting tuxedo. In conclusion, these elements result in an armored Zendaya that is not exactly walled off in a protective casing, but paradoxically, I think is transparent. The visual conventions of the fashion invite the eye and the imagination to delve through the armor to an imagined nude, to an imaginary embodiment of femininity, which is as much as a disguise, I think, as the armor is a costume. And with that, let me turn to Zuzu for her initial comments.
Okay, let me pull up my slides now, which we hope will work, being on someone else's laptop. Okay, hold on.
Oops, hold on a second here.
Hold on. Okay, I think this will work. Let me. Sorry, no, having a little bit of technical difficulties, but I'm going to share my screen now. All right. Okay, so let's see if this works. All right. So what I guess just to begin want to say about my own interest in armor began from my background in modeling. When I retired from modeling, I was very much thinking about hiding. Having been seen so much and having had my body on constant display, I was very interested in forms of covering and protecting, which I think armor has an interesting relationship to, because I think what I want to focus on tonight is that I feel like it has a relationship to both covering and displaying, as armor, as Andrew was just showing us a little bit. So I think what I want to ultimately land on is a kind of question about how everyday clothing can work as armor to cover the body, especially the female body, to like protect it from the gaze, whether it's the male gaze or whatever, and from sexualization and objectification. And thinking about that relationship of covering to display, I want to first begin by making a few points, looking at armor of the past and its relationship to covering and display. So I think we think of armor as mostly being to protect the body. And also, I think, Christina, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the armor that we think of as medieval is actually early modern, from the 16th and 15th and 16th centuries. And I think another misconception that we have is that actually this Renaissance armor was more about fashion, incorporated more of fashion than we tend to imagine. An example of that I just quickly want to show is this: the codpiece is a piece of armor that protected the genitals, but it was actually adopted from male civilian dress. So the codpiece developed. Actually, I think that there's a myth about its development as like a pouch for herbs to cure syphilis, which men needed to wear in Europe. But it became a fashion item that was not functional. It's just for the look of it, to kind of constructing a virile masculine ideal that emphasized the genitals, and it was adopted into armor, not for its protective value first and foremost, but in deference to the style. So I think that's just an important thing that when I found that out, I was very surprised, because I didn't think of armor as really, incorporating fashion or aesthetics in such a clear example as this it was. A second point I want to make is that, and this is building on what Andrew showed us, armor is as much about display as about protection. And that comes into focus very clearly in Renaissance Italy in the 1500s, where guns were already in use enough to be determining the outcome of battles. And metal plate armor, like we see here and like we think of traditionally associated with the Middle Ages, was not practical. It didn't really protect the body from firearms. So with the use of guns, this armor was still very popular, but not on the battlefield. It was being used in parades and ceremonies, and it was being commissioned by nobility to kind of like show their status, and it was customized to their identity with their family crest or whatever. So it was very much about the display of class, and it was also about the display of power. So I think here, this particular example is interesting. It's called armor alla Romana. It's like an archaizing form of armor, because even though it was made in the Renaissance, it was imitating ancient armor, armor from ancient Rome. But it was created in 1545. And it's, as you can see in the image, or hopefully everyone can see, it's kind of like molded to the shape of a male torso. So it's showing the muscles and the chest and the like super buff body that's supposed to be underneath it. Again, it's like erasing the idiosyncrasy of the actual body and producing an ideal. But I think here we can also think about this as nudity as a form of dress, quite literally just presenting like a quasi-naked body in outerwear, but also an extension of the skin, going off of what Andrew was talking about. And in particular, armor was used in this context to project an image of power, since it couldn't physically protect on the battlefield of the time. It was used to create an image of impermeability that would intimidate opponents before there was even a need for a battle or for war. So I think I want to just focus on its role in display and in creating an image in this time period. And then I guess just to bring it to what interests me mainly about armor is that the idea of projecting, or the idea of showing the body, because as we see in these two examples, kind of the codpiece is a form of covering that is clearly emphasizing. So it protects, but it accentuates the body part that it covers, as does this torso covering. It protects, but it covers, but it accentuates the muscles underneath it. This type of a covering, when applied to a female body, I think does not project an image of power or have a function of defense. I think a body conforming covering of a feminine figure does the opposite of protect, actually increases the vulnerability of that body by accentuating its femininity or its sexual vulnerability. And I guess here I'm just visually in this slide using as a visual link this artwork by this Pakistani artist Niza Khan from 2008, and she made a collection called The Skin She Wears. And you can just see how, like, to me, it feels very different to cover a female body in this like clinging body sculpting form. And so I've been thinking about that, and I kind of want to, I guess, when we open our discussion, I think Andrew and I have differing views on this slightly in a good way. That's quite interesting. But how tight clothing for women especially is, the display of their body does not project an image of power in the way that it might have for a male armor in Renaissance Italy. Display of the body in tight clothing is often what gets people to say, she was asking for it in cases of sexual assault. And I, in my experience, wanting not to be wanting not to be seen after my career, you know, and I adopted very baggy clothes and felt like that was a form of armor through hiding the body. And that similarly to this armor of Renaissance Italy, which wasn't physically protective of the body, of course, like wearing a baggy sweatshirt and baggy pants isn't going to physically protect my body from harm, but it is going to project an image of impenetrability, if not physical, at least rhetorical or symbolic. And it's also going to, I guess, communicate like a certain amount of like unattractiveness or uninterest or sexual unavailability or masculinity or queerness that would interfere somehow with the male gaze and with visual pleasure, which is a term that feminist critic Laura Mulvey introduces to describe traditionally men's enjoyment in looking at female bodies. So yeah, I guess I will end there since we're trying to get to more of a dialogue, and yeah.
Excuse me. Excellent. Yeah, so I think I wanted to just move into our sort of second part again. So we're going to sort of get in conversation, the three of us, and then after that, open it up to questions a little bit. Maybe one thing that I know that Zuzu and I have been talking a lot about as we've been sort of preparing for this is what to make of armor as a protective layer, as opposed to some of these ideas that link clothing to nudity and then to the extension of the skin, and then sort of this notion of being able to sort of penetrate in to someone rather than to be deflected away from. And maybe one image I'd like to sort of just bring into this and maybe have Zuzu comment on a little bit too, is that of Billie Eilish. So let me see if I can go into share mode here for a second. And so if you're not familiar with Billie Eilish, she's a pop singer of sorts. And this is rather traditional clothing for Billie Eilish. I've also got one more I'll just sort of scroll down to, but you get a sense of her clothing. So I think very much the way Zuzu describes, she's wearing very, very baggy clothing. And I think I find these images really interesting. And I think that Billie Eilish is a fascinating person. I think is very aware of the sort of power of visuality. And you know, I think unlike the Zendaya outfit, one of the ways I've been thinking about this is the distinction between maybe if armor is oftentimes not really protection from being viewed, and it is actually a kind of exposure, I think that this clothing is more of the opposite of that. I think, and I guess the terminology I'm sort of playing with is maybe shell versus armor. In the sense that I think that this sort of cocoons her from that sort of male gaze, and in a way that I think is quite successful, really. And I'm kind of curious, Zuzu, what you think about that distinction and Billie Eilish.
I think that's a good distinction. And I think when you said it, I sort of had like a identity crisis. I spent so many years thinking about armor, my uniform as being armor, but I think that does make sense, as armor having the role of display and this being not about display or an extension of the body. But I think like what I was thinking about today in relation to like a to like a baggy outfit is the way that it is trying to like convey a specific message in a similar way to, I think, what like that example of or the example of the Italian Renaissance armor was trying to convey its own message. And I think it is trying to like, it is partly for display in that sense, that it is for show, it is to be seen, it is to be read as putting up a wall. And in that sense, maybe it is doing a similar, like, it's like rhetorical defense, not physical defense. Or like, or yeah, manipulating an image in order to project a desire for, or a specific like presence in the world.
Yeah, I think it's very difficult. I think when it comes to clothing, I mean, so much of it is coded in ways, it comes pre-coded in a sense, right? And I think the fascinating thing I think about Eilish's outfits is somehow they don't trigger those codes. I think, I think if you look at this clothing, I think the only way I tend to think of it is urban, I guess. There's a kind of urban feel to this clothing that somehow still resists this sort of overarching emphasis of gendering. And I think it tends to somehow not do that. And I think that's, I don't quite understand how. Like I'm kind of fascinated by it because I'm not really sure what's going on. I think in some ways, for example, this is not masculine attire in the way that Marlene Dietrich's outfit is clearly masculine, although it isn't exactly feminine either. I mean, I think it's more typical of sort of urban rappers or something like that. But I think somehow it's slipping through the cracks a little bit, which I think makes that image kind of interesting. Maybe just moving on to like Christina, I'm curious if you know any more about what the charge was about. Is there more specificity about what the men's clothing that Joan of Arc supposedly wore? Do we have any idea about what that was?
So it's, yeah, I mean, so her story is so incredibly complicated, but it seems that they initially the court sent, they agree to a life imprisonment for her. She does a retraction and they agree to a life imprisonment. But when she's in prison, it seems that she donned men's clothing, right? And it seems that she did that for protection, to protect herself, the same as we're kind of discussing, that it was safer for her as a female. But there's really no to have men's clothing. But in jail, I mean, she's clearly not wearing armor, but it's some type of men's clothing, and that seems to have really aggravated the authorities. That she kind of retracted some of what she said, and again was sticking by this idea that she had visions and Charles VII should be the king, but then also that she seems to have put on men's clothing while in prison, right? And that then and that's when she is sentenced to be burned. So I don't think that final thing that kind of pushes it over where she then becomes is burned to death as a heretic. It doesn't seem to be armor. It just seems to be men's clothing, but it's very, very vague what exactly that looks like. Which is totally in keeping when you're looking at medieval sources. Often they are vague from our perspective. So.
Yeah, it's a frustrating time. You just don't have the resources that you have, documentary resources you have today, really, to look at these sorts of things.
But I just want to say, I think, when you're looking at, well, for the Middle Ages, or even in today's world, when you're looking at cultures where religion is really important, this is true whether it's Christianity, Judaism, Islam, there is a sense just in general of you cover your body, right? It's part of modesty. You're not supposed to be sexualizing yourself. You cover the body as a way of being modest, and that's in conjunction with religion, with ideas about respect for God, right? So so that also is connected in with the history of wearing lots of clothes or wearing loose clothes where you don't see the shape of somebody's body. So
yeah, it reminds me a little bit about some of the sort of sodomy laws from the time too, especially the early modern period. I think that apparently, like oftentimes sort of at the beginning of that period, women could sort of get away with same-sex relationships provided that they were still feminine presenting. But once they started to dress, one might dress as a man or use implements in sex, that those ran afoul of those rules. And it seems like you're seeing the emergence of that distinction between the proper role of femininity and the proper role of masculinity.
Right. Well, and yeah, and women are supposed to be in the passive role and under male authority. So anything that bridges that, is seen as a problem. Anything that goes against that. So.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Let's see what else.
There's a comment in the chat.
Oh yeah, let me get to that. So yeah, so Malky wrote, "I'm saddened that Billy is going to be the opposite extreme for protection." Yeah, I don't know, Malky, do you want to elaborate on that? What you mean by that comment?
So we've established, that baggy dresses protect a woman with her modesty, but we've learned that how the British royal family dresses, that is beautiful and accentuates femininity, but with enough modest, and by wearing baggy and boyish clothing, that takes away the beauty of being feminine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that's an interesting question, right? Is that, is there a way to perform femininity in a way that doesn't require that, right? And I think one of the things that gets at, I think, is also just the role of vision in men in particular, right? So we have this phrase, the male gaze, this idea that oftentimes when we look at images, we're really looking at women in particular through a sort of heterosexual male lens, is really, constitutes this idea of the male gaze. And is it possible to have a kind of femininity that doesn't result in that vulnerability is an interesting question. I don't know if anybody wants to take that up. Yeah, I mean, I would say personally, I think, to me, I think, teaching gender studies, I think that unfortunately, I think the core notion of femininity is really passivity. And so I think that once you think about the primary binary between masculinity and femininity being activity versus passivity, I think that bodes badly for femininity. I think that I think that creates vulnerability inherently, I think, in that conception of femininity. I think unless we can reconceptualize and have other forms of femininities that break out of that, then I'm not sure that we can do that. I do understand your unhappiness perhaps with Billie Eilish's look, but one of the things that I do find interesting about that look, and I'm just going to try to find that again. There's my image here. Is I think she still looks female, right? I think one of the fascinating things, and maybe I'll just go back into share mode for a second, right, is that I think there's many things about her that are, you don't wonder whether Billie Eilish is male or not, for instance, right? And so I think one of the things that I find really interesting and I think successful about her clothing is that it doesn't seem to have to disappear into a non-binary perspective or a radically androgynous perspective in order to achieve the look that she's going for. And so, I can understand one not liking that aesthetic, but I actually find that rather inspiring. I think if she can pull that off, maybe there are other options, other ways of doing that. I don't know what people think about it. Oh, and let's see, Malky says, and then it's hard. Yeah. Well, so I think I think one of the things we don't want to argue is that women shouldn't be able to dress how they want, right? But I think what we're interested in is, does that lead to a certain kind of vulnerability? And obviously, I think all of us would agree that women should be able to dress any way they want and should be in an environment that's safe. I think that that I hope goes without saying. Let's see, where are we here? Yeah, so we are at about 7:50. So I think we have about 10 minutes left. And I guess I'm glad we've already sort of kind of started by getting audience involvement. Oh, let's see. Gabrielle says, sorry.
Hello?
Oh, yep.
It's me, Albert. I have a comment about
Yep.
what we just presented. I remember that I'm a church of Pentecost, and when we comes to America, here in Africa it's hot, so women are not allowed to wear pants to the churches. But the excuses that they were giving at the American churches is the weather. Due to the weather, the church has now allowed women to wear pants to the church. So as we go to the church in the Bronx, you see some women wearing men's clothes to the church, and it's accepted here. But when they get back to Africa, like Ghana, and then you are wearing pants to the church, you'll be, people will be gossiping about you. So one of the excuses people give in America is all because of the weather, we are supposed to not to be in the clothes. So that become a very big issue in the Bronx, our church. And finally, they allow, because of the excuses the women brought, they allowed them to wear pants. But when they go back home, they can't put it on. Yeah. That's my point of view.
Yeah, Christina or Zuzu, would either of you like to comment on that?
I don't think I have anything to.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Yeah. Well, I just want to make sure there are several different comments, and Long has his hand raised, so I just want to make sure we get to
Oh, we get
everybody.
everybody in there? Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
but
Maybe I'll
thank
just
you,
make-
Albert. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe I'll just
You're
make one quick comment about that before we move on to the other chat comments and then to Long. I mean, one interesting phenomenon I think is that a lot of clothing over time really migrates from being exclusively male clothing to being acceptably female clothing, and pants I think is a pretty good example of that. And so it may be true that outside. So I think that that pants is a pretty good example of what we're talking about, and I think there are lots of other kinds of clothing that tends to move in that direction. Occasionally, there's elements of female attire that become male attire. Earrings, I think, is a kind of interesting example of that as well. And I think, but it's interesting that usually it tends to move from male to female and less so female to male, which I think also is a sad commentary on notions of femininity, unfortunately. Yeah, so let me just go to, let's see the comments here in the chat, and then we'll go to Long. So sorry, I'm at work, so I can't use my mic, but I wonder how a lot of this translates into present day uses of digital body obscuring like Facetune and Photoshop, and how those act as armor for vulnerability. Oh yeah, those are interesting comments. Yeah, anybody want to take those?
I mean, I guess just maybe this is super obvious, but like presenting a face for display, that's not like it's a distinction between almost nudity and nakedness. It's like nakedness might be your natural face, and nudity is your face as it's made up to be seen with the awareness of being seen, which I guess, is a kind of mask or armor or something like that. I think that's interesting. That's an interesting idea.
Yeah. Let's see, the next remark here was, do you think there is a way for positive sexuality, be that in the display of the body or something else?
Andrew, I feel like that's for you. That's
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I mean, I think I'm pretty. I think there is space for positive sexuality. I have to say, I'm relatively optimistic about that. I mean, I think the one thing, I mean, I think that we're a weirdly kind of schizophrenic society. On the one hand, if you look at a lot of advertising, we're awash in these images. You know, like trying to put together images for this presentation, like I Google lingerie to get a good shot for, you know, one of the slides, and it's like, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed by stuff, right? On the other hand, nobody really wants to talk about this in any other venue. And I think you can see a lot of the laws that are being passed across the many states these days are really about shutting down conversation about sex and sexuality. And so I think that is true. I do think that, I think with the rise of gender studies and more commentary, I think, you know, everybody, I think, has to become more of an educated consumer of this. And I think that's why you know, I think gender studies classes, for example, are pretty popular. And so I do think that we can move toward a more healthy notion of sexuality that doesn't abandon notions of visuality. You know, one of the things, maybe just really quickly, in my presentation, I really didn't get a chance to talk about it too much, but I'll mention this one picture. There's this picture of Helene Formant. Maybe I can just Google her. And it's loading slowly, of course. Here it is. And so this is Rubens's wife. And one of the things that John Berger, who talks about nakedness and nudity, actually likes this image very much. And his argument for liking it, I think, is an interesting one. And I think also presents an argument for a notion of positive sexuality. What he really loves about this painting by Rubens of his wife is that she's caught in the act of turning toward him, and that she is not, you know, trying to display her body. She isn't anticipating being viewed, that she's an active subject in this, that she is gazing directly at him, not in a kind of come hither way that's more passive in nature. And the activity of her turning seems present in the image. And so he finds this a good example of nakedness. And I think one where you can, you know, he's interested in this notion of being oneself. And I have to say, I'm not sure I entirely agree that one can be oneself authentically, whatever that means. But I do get at what he's saying there. And I think there is, you know, this is an image that I think is beautiful. It's sensual, but I don't think I think Berger would argue that it's not an exploitative image, and that it represents Helene Formant in her particularity and celebrates her as an individual, as opposed to just simply an object of some sort of imaginary notion of what sexuality should be. So I guess there's my short answer to that. Let's see. The next question here is from Emily. Zuzu, your modeling background must have given you interesting experiences of this sort. Do you have any specific stories about altering your appearance as a form of armor or shell?
Yes, yes. Yeah, we do have another medievalist in the room, with Emily being here when you were talking about reading medieval manuscripts. I was like, ooh. But yeah, I guess like when I think just experiencing wearing casting outfits as a model was so different from wearing regular clothes or explicitly baggy clothes afterwards. And I think that like wearing tight clothes for the sake of a casting, the point of that outfit is to display your body, to make it look appealing, but you also have to get to and from the casting. You also have to wear that kind of attractive, appealing outfit on the street, and you know, walking down the street wearing a form-fitting outfit that reveals your body is such a different feeling. You feel so vulnerable, or I guess I should use I felt so vulnerable, and you know, attracted like catcalls and attention, unwanted attention, and was also photographed, you know, being on the street by like street style photographers. And then there was an instance after I stopped modeling, like 6 months later, wearing baggy kind of drab black, gray clothes, and walking through a crowd outside of a show in Fashion Week, which I was no longer a part of at all, and expecting that the photographers who were waiting outside would take my picture and would notice me, and I walked right past them and nobody turned their head at all. And that kind of invisibility that my clothes allowed me, and it was other things too, as well as like that I changed my appearance in certain ways about my hair and my I guess kind of like a more masculine presentation, and my body weight had also changed and increased, and all of these things functioned as a sort of armor. And you know, thinking about the ways that, like, I guess, you know, many things could be conceptualized as armor in that way, like age for women could be conceptualized as armor, making them unattractive to men. You know, fatness could be conceptualized as armor or invisibility. Disability could be conceptualized as like a, you know, an invisibilizing force that that like would deter the like the visual pleasure, the male gaze, this like sexualizing, unwanted sexualization. And I guess, like, yeah, I've also been reading a bit about camouflage and about like how that works visually, like what perceptual mechanisms in animal perception, mainly, not humans, but animal perception, what mechanisms are tricked by camouflage. And basically the like animals are trained biologically to recognize shapes, to be able to detect shapes. And I think that that's really interesting if you think about tight clothes revealing a shape being recognizable as a woman or something, whereas, you know, baggy clothes is blurring that shape in a way that is almost like a form of camouflage to protect you from a predator, as, you know, as prey, as a woman in public space. Yeah. Thank you for the question, Emily.
Yeah, nicely said. One last chat comment, and then we'll get to Long. What about a suit as modern armor and the displeasure Hillary Clinton faced for wearing pantsuits?
That's a great comment. I don't know how to respond to that exactly, but I think that's a really great comment. You know, but then, you know, you get into questions. I mean, she really as a first. I mean, we just don't have models of, you know, paradigms of women going for these top levels of power until fairly recently, right? Because power throughout history, it's mainly male kings and male presidents. So I think you also get into the question, well, what you know, what could she have worn? I mean, no matter what, you're going to be, you're kind of in no-win territory, it seems to me. You know, and I'm just thinking some of the prime ministers in the northern European nations, you know, there's a lot of criticism of them, no matter what they wear, it seems to me. You know, including, you know, Sanna Marin in Finland, who got into a whole lot of trouble for dancing with a group of friends where she was, you know, wearing casual clothes. Yeah, I think at this point, women, it just seems to me women can't win in some ways. But for sure, she got a lot of criticism on the pantsuits.
Yeah.
Another thing that I was thinking in response to Leo, in response to your question, is that I was reading a comment by the clothing historian Valerie Steele, who works for FIT, and she was talking about clothing as armor in a totally different way than I had been, and that we have been tonight talking about clothing as armor. She was talking about it as any clothing that makes you feel empowered. And so her example was the little black dress is a form of armor because that makes you feel like hot walking into a room or whatever. And she also gave the example of the smoking, how do you pronounce it? The Yves Saint Laurent like suit from the 1940s. I shouldn't talk about fashion history until I know the date for sure. But like a suit designed for women that here, let me see if I can pull up an image. Or Andrew, you might beat me to it.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find that. I don't know that suit. 1940s, you said?
Yes, or just Saint Laurent. Maybe it's not 1940s. But that basically, like, she gave that suit as an example of armor in the sense that it was an empowering outfit. And I guess that's just defining armor in the feeling of empowerment that it gives its wearer, which is an interesting definition.
Got a page loading slowly. I think I've got it here. Is this it? Tell me if this is what you had in mind.
Yes, and I think yes, I'll find even, I think official version, but I think, yes, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I would say that I think Hillary Clinton's pantsuit is really a kind of failed Marlene Dietrich, right? I think that it's appropriating male power in a way that's not considered acceptable. In just the same way, I think that you have male power being appropriated by Joan of Arc, right? And I think, as Christina's saying, I think women are always in a double bind, right? That, either, you have to be sexy, but if you're sexy, you can't wield genuine power. And if you wield genuine power, you're not sexy, and that's not okay either. Yeah. And I think, Marlene Dietrich is so sexualized that I think that endangers any real sense of power that she has. I think that's always the tightrope that women are forced to walk. All right, maybe we could get to, I know we're actually over time, but maybe we could end with one more comment or question by Long.
Yeah, hey, can you all hear me?
Oh, just speak up a little bit.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, great. So thank you all for this. It's been really helpful. In line with the kind of search for an alternative form of femininity, perhaps one that is more positive, rebellious, subversive, I can offer maybe a little personal anecdote, but from what I've seen recently in the Philly area, there's been this trend in not wearing bra, going braless, literally bra burning culture there in the form of fashion, but also not shaving your armpits, going countercultural to the kind of feminine tradition. Some of that offering more kind of vulnerability, like less kind of obstacles and coverage, but some of that also involving in, I think, adding more layers of protection in the case of growing out your armpit hair. So, but from what I've seen, like even in co-ed spaces, women seem very comfortable in going about braless and kind of participating in these countercultural expressions. So, in one way, like it's certainly, shedding more layers, right? You're not even wearing your bra this time. So traditionally that can be seen as maybe counterintuitive and protecting the vulnerability of a woman. But in another sense, like it seems that everyone participating in this especially seems very empowered and kind of protected by this new liberation. So I was wondering, maybe perhaps that is a new or an alternative form of femininity that can be more positive.
Yeah, I have to say, I think that's really interesting, right? I mean, you're really like, flipping the script on things, right? That if, adding these layers is really about the display of what's underneath, then maybe displaying more of what's underneath is more of a real armor or a real way of expressing invulnerability. I think is a really interesting idea.
So, I mean, this is a very like unintellectual answer, but I think part of it, you're just getting, I think these days there are a number of people, you just want to be comfortable, right? So you wear flat shoes and you wear, you maybe don't wear a bra. you know, and you wear an extra sweater over your shirt, or, you know, there are different, you know, I think, you know, you also get into just sort of basic issues about comfort, that I think have become, I think a lot of people, or at least some people, want to just be more comfortable, you know, and I want to just, no, so I think that's a really interesting point. And even, you know, with the underarm hair, you know, I mean, people come with, you know, with underarm hair, right? So you have to like make the effort to take it off. And again, I just think a lot of people these days, you know, in many ways, they just don't want to, you know, sometimes deal with all of that. I mean, I mean, being female and doing all this stuff, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of time. And I think to some extent, you know, many people these days just have other priorities, right? So again, that's not an intellectual kind of answer, but also just on a human sort of basis every day. And I wanted to just say one other thing just real quick. I mean, we live in a world where we do have all these photographs, and now with the cameras, you know, I mean, we're surrounded with all this stuff and selfies. We all know what we look like. There are mirrors everywhere, you know. But I think what's interesting, if you go back a few centuries, you don't have mirrors everywhere. I mean, we live in an age where we have the technology and mass production, and you certainly don't have photos until 200 years ago. So I think we're much more, from a subjective level, experiential. I think the way we experience ourselves, we're much more aware of gaze, right, and how we look. And part of that is our own gaze. And so I think our dynamic today, on an experiential level, as individual women, is different than in the past, or for most of history. So that's sort of a non sequitur, but I just wanted to, you know, to mention that.
Yeah, I think just, Christina, real quick, adding off of your point when you said it's a lot of work to produce a, you know, beautiful image. I think it just made me think of Susan Bordeaux, who is a feminist theorist who has written a lot about the amount of work it takes and how historically beauty ideals have functioned to distract women and take up their time and their resources and their money and their energy. You know, from the corset to contemporary, like, thin ideals, you know, and fitness craze, and how much time women spend working against their, you know, against their own bodies in different ways to produce a beautiful image. And she connects that to Foucault and being a useful body, for a certain regime. But yeah, so it just made me think of that.
No, exactly. And I think sometimes, yeah, and whether you're wearing corsets or girdles or sometimes for certain kinds of bras, etc., it's just a tremendous, and then all the makeup stuff, it's just a tremendous amount of work, tremendous. And you know, and again, we just sort of take it for granted because that's how we're socialized. So I definitely agree with Susan Bordeaux and on that and many issues.
Yep. Excellent. Well, I think maybe that's a good place to leave it. I know we're over 10 minutes over time. So I just want to thank you all for being fellow panelists with me, and also for the audience for the wonderful questions and comments. And thank you for coming.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Andrew.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Zuzu and Andrew, and thank you everyone for coming.